see so many folk here. Welcome everybody for another SPRU Friday seminar. This one's going to really cross quite a lot of ground between people thinking about futures, people thinking about industry innovation strategies, and people thinking about energy. Because it's a real pleasure to welcome Laura Watts here, whose work I've been watching. I don't know enough about it, but it's really been a great chance catching up here. And it's been really informative in my own mind the times I've come across it. A lot of us, not least me, bang on about transdisciplinarity, but Laura, actually, I think you embodied that in a way few people do in not only interdisciplinary movement between SDS, innovation studies, ethnography, but also working with business, working in the IT university in Copenhagen, now having been in SDS departments in the UK, but also writing poetry, hanging out a lot with archaeologists, which I think will come over. So there's quite a mix of influences, which I think will really come over. And the title is fascinating. We need people who can dream of things that never were. There's all sorts of resonances on that. So welcome, Laura. I think people know the routine. I will just state it, though, just so we know. So we've got the next hour in this session. Laura will talk for 40, 45 minutes, have some discussion. Then we break for a few minutes. Those who are going to stay on for the panel session are welcome to coffee, but those who are not staying for the panel session, this is Tommaso's fierce space, are not to have coffee. Then when people are filtered through, then we have a panel session. We've got 3 respondents, and we'll have a more in-depth, informal discussion on that basis. So, sorry to bang on so much.
That's fine.
Laura, take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. As Andy said, I have a very diverse background. Coming over here from Copenhagen, and I should say that what I've learned basically, you're an incredibly diverse audience, which is fabulous for me. You're also very interdisciplinary. So what my work is going to do for the next 40 minutes is I'm going to talk very much focused around my empirical ethnographic data. I'm going to point to various different kinds of bits of theories and authors that I'm drawing upon, but I'm not going to be doing such a huge amount of work to talk about that. So in questions afterwards, I'm very happy to answer questions about some of the more kind of methodological, theoretical underpinnings that I'm going to be using, because as I said, I'm going to play that down slightly. So, my talk, we need people who can dream of things that never were, the Defiant Islands of Marine Renewable Energy. And I'm going to read this as a script, partly to do with the fact that I'm actually going to be telling you a series of stories. And the stories are unfolded in this script. Prologue. When you arrive as a visitor to the European Marine Energy Centre in the islands of Orkney, this is what you read painted over the entrance. The problems of the world cannot possibly be solved by skeptics or cynics whose horizons are limited by the obvious realities. We need people who can dream of things that never were. Perhaps you are part of a BBC film crew or a delegation from Silicon Valley, or an ethnographer like myself, come to these remote islands off the north coast of Scotland. But you are here because this is a world centre for testing marine energy devices, that is, making electricity from the waves and tides. The quote is from John F. Kennedy, the president who chose to go to the moon in this decade. The sheer social, technical, infrastructural and environmental complexity of marine energy has been likened by the director of EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre, to the space age, or to going from the Wright brothers' first flight to an entire airline industry. As he puts it, the first devices are for sale, but we have not yet mastered our art. Estimates are that UK wave and tide power could generate 30 to 50 gigawatts, which is around 20% of the UK's current demand. And a quarter of Europe's entire tidal energy resource is in Scotland, and much of that is in Orkney. They've been at this since EMEC opened its doors 10 years ago, and they are the world's first grid-connected marine energy test site. They now have 14 different marine energy devices being tested in Orkney, 6 wave energy devices and 8 tide energy devices, with developers as diverse as Alstom, Voith and Finland's Wello. I've been returning to Orkney for the past 6 years as a science and technology studies ethnographer, and I've been collaborating with the many different people and places who are involved in energy future making here. So, Orkney. It's closer to the Arctic Circle than to London. Beef farming and tourism are the main industries. So in the normative version of urban innovation centres, the islands are supposed to be some kind of rural periphery. And yet, it is here where a new energy industry akin to space technology is in development. World first, space technology. It's easy to succumb to a drum-beating, heroic narrative, savvy islanders triumphing in the face of extraordinary technical and political odds. Orkney is proud of its Norse heritage. It has its own Icelandic Orkneyinga saga, and it's hard not to tell heroic Viking stories here. I want to tell you about the fishermen, the divers, the marine biologists, the full-time bird watchers who spend every day sitting out monitoring the sea. And don't get me started on the anchors, the life sensors and the racks of data equipment. All those in Orkney who are at the hard work of figuring out what the industry is going to look like, how it will work as an eco-socio-technical infrastructure, how you are going to go from one device in the water to an entire seaborne energy system. Policymakers and funders both want such a nice, smooth story, preferably told in kilowatt hours, as though the quantity of Orkney electrons on the electricity grid is indicative. But such a heroic story is too bigsy, as they say in Orkney. It's too big for its boots. It's too immodest. Modesty is a quality both people in Orkney and feminist philosopher of science Donna Haraway care about, and so do I. There are other stories to tell about marine energy. I want to tell you 3 of them. 3 stories that are all about the making of marine green electrons and getting them on the national grid. One heroic and hopeful, one hopeless, and one something else. Story 1, hope. Technology stories, especially marine energy stories, are full of hope. My colleague Casper Brun-Jensen argues that a post-critical science and technology studies, such as work by philosopher of science Isabel Stengers, is full of hope. Many researchers, myself included, acknowledging that our work performs the world, and so is always political, always practical. We hope, and I hope, that its rehearsal makes a better world, whilst acknowledging the inherent impossibility of that being universal and unproblematic, whilst acknowledging that hope is situated contingent. Critique has run out of steam, said Bruno Latour, and so our ethnographic methods are now methods of hope, as with Hirokazu Miyazaki. But in the face of obdurate authorities, what world does our academic research hope to make possible? What can we hope for? Should we hope? Isabel Stengers, philosopher of cosmopolitics, speaks lyrically of hope. Stengers regards hope as possibility, as thinking, in the face of existing closed probability. Hope, she says, is a creative event, flying in the teeth of already calculated probabilities authorised by the world. She said it is about trying to feel what lurks in the interstices, at the edges, in the gaps, in the seas between islands of probability. Something new lurks and is being dreamed, like marine energy. Let me then tell you an ethnographic story of hope. So meet John the farmer, and he also has a dog called Billy, who I don't have a photograph of. But John is a crofter. That is, his farm in Orkney is small scale. It's a few organic Highland cattle. He's got some sheep and a few chickens. It's farmed by himself and Billy. Never forget the dog. John owns land earmarked by Scottish and Southern Electricity, SSE, for 2 new electricity substations. The first, for where a new grid cable will hopefully come ashore to increase the national electricity grid capacity between Orkney and mainland UK. The second, for an SSE-funded commercial wave energy farm, which will be, hopefully, sited just off the Atlantic coastline from his farm. Two completely different substations and installation projects run by the same company. I walk with him through his farm along the cliff top. He points out two locations for the different substations, wind-swept grass inlets well back from the flagstone cliff edge. Later, around the neighbour's kitchen table, he talks about his frustrations with the whole situation. For the last 2 years, he has had different people from SSE and their contractors, all seemingly unknown to each other, knock on his door and tell him about the rare plants he has on his land, as if he didn't know. Letters have been exchanged about the sale of his land, but then negotiations have just slid away into silence. One person turned up one day from SSE and said they were going to start digging up one of his fields the next week, causing him serious emotional upset and uncertainty. Without that feed for his cattle, he can't keep his farm. John is very aware that as an infrastructure project, the company does have the legal right to compulsory purchase the land without his permission. He has tried to explain to the various people who appear on his doorstep that the land they are speaking of is essential to his entire farm. He wants to hand his farm on to his children, but now his future and theirs is uncertain. What can we do in the face of random strangers who are walking through a project management process, going through the statutory environmental impact assessment, or rather, 2 EIAs by 2 different consultancies, one for each of the infrastructure projects, both reporting back to SSE, but who are, it seems, being blown hither and thither by the winds of organisational and political change. What can he do? Well, John the farmer is savvy of land and politics. Like many people in Orkney, he keeps asking the question, how will the community benefit from marine energy? Around 200 people are currently employed in marine energy in Orkney, and there are several hundred more involved indirectly, from divers to sonar technicians. The development of these supply chain companies has happened largely due to the European Marine Energy Centre test site. It's a start. Now, however, as I said, there's a commercial wave energy projects that are in progress. The Crown Estate, the owners of the sea, who are a quasi-government organisation with no democratic accountability, have recently begun licensing areas of the sea for commercial-scale marine energy generation. I believe this is one of the first commercial-scale projects in the world. Major energy consortia, including SSE, have purchased licences to farm areas of the sea around Orkney and elsewhere. This is a fragile seascape, however, fragile both ecologically and socio-economically. EMEC have had devices in the sea for over 10 years now, and they've been learning to support these fragile relations, both with fish, seabirds, mammals, but also with jobs in the local economy. Orkney folk, as a result of this long-term relationship, are now very, very familiar with marine energy. You see devices in the water, you see them out of the water, you see them on docksides, you see them in a newspaper, you see them in the radio every week, if not every day. It's what everyone talks about over their cups of coffee around the farmhouse table. The bookshop keeper, for example, knows that a wave energy farm equates to hundreds of hulking bits of metal, each the size of a boat, in the sea outside his house. Those that float must be painted bright red and yellow as a shipping hazard warning, a standard that EMEX had to negotiate on behalf of the industry. But as a local artist said, it is going to stamp itself utterly, visually, on the landscape. So, in return for having their sea painted by hundreds of brightly coloured devices all bouncing and bobbing about, in return for the local fishers being banned from fishing large parts of the shoreline where they currently fish for lobster, in return for local marine wildlife undergoing some major changes, there's a massive marine park here, the wildlife in Orkney is protected under various forms of legislation, but the changes are not necessarily bad ones, it's complicated. In return for all these What can they hope for? That is John the farmer's question. And it is many others in Orkney. But it's not John the farmer who is farming the sea, or any of the local fishermen. It is, of course, SSE who are the farmer, the big public limited company. They and their shareholders are the ones who are going to benefit. John the farmer is explicit. He is not anti-marine energy, not at all. He is a farmer. He understands the compromises and infrastructure needed to transform a natural resource into a cultural commodity. And he also knows he has literally landed in the eye of the marine energy storm. He has the land. But what leverage does he have as a crofter? What he's done is he has approached the local island council to ask for help, the Orkney Islands Council. Because there's a precedent in nearby Shetland who, during the sale of their land for an oil terminal in the 1970s, quite famously negotiated a trust fund for the islands and for the community there. But unfortunately, the Islands Council in Orkney is not yet willing to get involved, not least they are not swimming in resources either. As you probably know, the government austerity regime exerted on local councils has led to massive cutbacks in jobs and services. So what can he and others in Orkney hope for? Well, jobs are one. For SSE to get marine energy devices in the water, get the metal wet, as they say in EMEC, it requires Orkney practical expertise. It requires local people, like mariners who do know how you might anchor something the size of a boat in 8 knots of tide. If anyone knows about tide, that's a lot. They need people like the marine biologists, the marine archaeologists, and environmental consultants like these guys who know how to make an environmental impact assessment that makes the relations between a tide energy turbine and a local farmer, as well as an island, a national electricity grid, marine wildlife, fishers, and sometimes even local poets. All these things have to be folded in an EIA. They know how to do those relations. They know how to act in ways to make a marine energy industry hold together, not just because they are experienced professionals who have been at this for 10 years, but because they live in Orkney. They know the place and they know the sea there. SSE, the UK government and the Crown Estate need this embodied expertise. People who live elsewhere are rarely authorities and have knowledge about Orkney or its sea, for knowledge is situated, and in marine energy it's frequently embodied. You can't write a lot of this stuff down. So jobs is one. Another hope is via community ownership. The Crown Estate regards its leasing round as part of their commitment to help realise the UK's renewable energy and carbon reduction targets. But no one knows the sums involved, they're not public, about how the leases were priced. The only thing we do know is that an Orkney consortium who did make a bid for a lease in an attempt to participate in this Klondike sale of their local waves and tides were priced out. So that's been an issue, getting local ownership. But a third hope, what about hope for the industry? Does Orkney hope that those behemoths, SSE, the UK government, the Crown Estate, will miraculously establish some set of relations that will make a marine industry happen? It hasn't happened yet, it's in the making. Are they hoping for all these large organisations to benefit or to act in ways that benefit their fragile islands? Well, to answer this, I need to tell you a second story. But this one's going to be a bit less hopeful. Story 2, hopeless. Hold on to your hats. 2 years ago, in September 2012, a representative from the local electricity operator, SSE, Scottish and Southern Electric again, arrived in Orkney unannounced and made a sudden public announcement to everyone. From that day forward, they said there would be no further electricity generation permitted in Orkney. The situation may not be resolved until 2020, said the representative. The Islands Council, who had been managing planning permission for potentially hundreds of new wind turbines, and all those who had invested and were poised to install one, were aghast. It was shot everywhere. Now, like I said, there's currently one undersea cable that connects Orkney to the rest of the UK national grid. But over the past few years, community-owned wind turbines have proliferated in Orkney. An example here. In a place where electricity supply is temperamental in winter storms and very expensive to buy, energy poverty is more extreme in Orkney than pretty much anywhere in the UK, there are now 700 local micro-turbines. That's more per capita than anywhere else in the country. As a result of this, plus many full-scale island community trust-owned turbines and the Marine Energy Test Site, EMEC, the undersea cable here is now literally overheating. Orkney is generating more electricity than it can use and transmit south. It is, on many days of the year, more than 100% energy sustainable. The poor old post-war national electricity grid was designed to supply islanders from fossil fuel power stations down south, not for large-scale transmission in the opposite direction. SSE says that another undersea cable to mainland Scotland is needed to resolve the overloading issue. Now, as I'm fairly certain most of you here know, electricity supply is privatised in the UK. SSE are a profit-making public limited company, which means that they need a financial incentive to install a new cable costing £1 billion or so. They need a big new customer or a government directive to even contemplate a new cable. And bluntly, locally owned island wind turbines and a marine energy test site are not ever going to be a big enough customer to warrant the cost of putting in a new cable. The only potential customer of sufficient scale is one of the commercial marine energy projects. And combined, these commercial projects are talked about in terms of around 1 gigawatt of electricity generated by hundreds of marine devices, wave and tide. That is a lot of electricity, right? And that's enough to need another cable. But marine energy, as I said, is an industry in the making. Its socio-economic and technical relations are yet to harden. No one's quite sure how you keep hundreds of devices anchored in place, how you maintain them over for years, or quite what the interaction with the local population will be, whether that's people or marine wildlife, on land and in the water. Things just don't scale up in the sea. Waves don't just get bigger, nor can you go from just one prototype to an array. You don't just drop a few hundred devices in the sea and magically transmit marine green electrons to your house. No more than you might throw a few hundred aeroplanes in the air and expect people to be magically transported to New York. You need infrastructure. It's hard to calculate the risk for something that's never been done before anywhere on the planet. And the energy consortia who have bought the leases to the sea keep slipping their dates. At the moment, and it's right off the ethnographic hot press, SSE commercial wave energy project has now gone quiet, and instead some of you might have heard the recent noise around Maygen, which is a tidal energy project in the same area. So with all this slippage, the dates for the cable installation keep slipping, as John the farmer is very much experiencing. Until the additional cable is installed at the European Marine Energy Centre, they can't grow. Arrays of several devices being tested together can't happen. The international developers who come from all over the world who have brought their devices there for testing might be forced to go elsewhere. Further, low-carbon, renewable energy generation from the massive wind resource in Orkney can't go on the grid. And the island communities cannot financially benefit from the sale of their local resource. What hope does Orkney have in the face of the calculated probabilities of risk by consultancies and companies located so far from the hard blast of salt air that has so much of the energy that's being transformed? What hope does the small-scale, edge-located marine energy industry which EMEC represents have in the face of centralised policy and a centralised national grid? It seems a hopeless story. What other story is there to tell? Story 3, Defiance. Stand with me on this hill, Costa Head, and look out over mainland Orkney. There's a blue sound here between the hill and the rising dark of Rousey Island. There's cold wind or fresh on your face after the 10-minute walk up through a herd of black Angus cows. Look with me at that concrete monument near the summit. A kist? A concrete burial mound, perhaps? This is the resting place of the British wind industry that never was. Here stood the UK's, possibly the world's first, large-scale experimental wind turbine, which was installed in 1951. Later, on the dark hill, if you look round in front of you, on the horizon there, where a line of turbines now stalks the sky, the world's largest prototype wind turbine stood for 15 years until it was demolished in 1999. The EMET director speaks of this hallowed ground of renewable energy as a place where we blinked. Orkney has long been a place of energy innovation, a place where the future comes early, and a place where futures have been abandoned by decision makers from south who blinked. In contrast, the Danish wind industry, where I'm from, in contrast, the Danish wind industry, where the UK now buys its wind turbines from, has an export market worth something like 50 billion euros. Given this history, what hope is there? I think there is none. But stay with me, because I do not despair. When I say it is hopeless, I mean that no one I have encountered in Orkney believes some external phenomena will come and fix things. No one believes some Viking ship full of venture capitalist gold will come sailing in. Nor do they believe that some sovereign owner or a mysterious political benefactor will magically make the right choice. I propose that the situation is hopeless because I do not believe that on evidence John the farmer or the director of EMET or anyone else I've been involved with in Orkney Marine Energy hopes in blind faith for a good outcome. But neither have they given up in despair. So if they do not hope in blind faith for the best thing to happen, and neither have they given up in despair, which is the usual alternative, what else is there? How do they act to make this dream of things that never were? Okay, we're going to do a brief aside. I need to introduce you to a figure who I've been walking with. Earlier I talked about Isabel Stenger's version of hope, her call for creative thinking as a resistance to the authority of probable outcomes. But if we are going to talk about hope as a method, then it seems worth remembering the importance of hope and hopelessness in prior philosophical work. So I've been walking up this hill with company. I've been walking with a figure from work of existential philosopher Albert Camus. So as we look out over the heather and hills of Orkney, and I very much recommend you actually do so, it's a fantastic place, we walk hopeless yet without despair, for alongside us is a figure who's shivering and sweating. It's a figure who has always worked without toil, without hope upon a hillside. A figure who has always pushed weighty futures up hills of possibility such as this one, and then had those futures fail, fall back down, but they must be done again. The figure, our guide, as I've heard someone say, is Sisyphus. Sisyphus, for those who may not know, I had to find out details. Sisyphus was condemned by the Greek gods to push his rock uphill to reach the summit, and for his rock to roll back down again, for him to have to begin again. Forever pushing his rock uphill without end. His life is absurd. Sisyphus is my guide to the modest, mundane toil of marine energy in Orkney. He's a very unheroic figure from Camus' absurdist philosophy. So in Camus, hopelessness is essential to making meaning and making the world. Camus argues that Sisyphus is happy and without despair as a direct effect of his acceptance of his hopelessness of his life. Sisyphus experiences this happiness. He continues to keep acting, keep rolling his rock uphill, let it fall back down again, through his acceptance of his meaningless task and his refusal to hope in blind faith for a reprieve. Sisyphus does not look to any external phenomena for meaning in his task. This refusal is a mirror of the unresolvable tension between the meaningless of the universe and the human desire to create meaning. That's the existential move. But the crucial move for me is that Sisyphus takes ownership of his task. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. This is his task, and so he can imagine and invent a myriad of meanings for his task, but they are his to invent, not given. Sisyphus is self-determined. He gives no authority to an external figure. He is free to live as he chooses within the absurd boundary of his life. So for me, his rock can be understood as these social material resistances of the relational world, the partiality. You know, Orkney is different geographically, politically, socioeconomy to here in this room, right? The histories, the local identities, the sea is different there in Orkney as it is here. There's no universalism in this figure for me. So Sisyphus continues to keep working as a result of his refusal and as a result of his acceptance of the absurdity of what he's doing. I think this has a nice sort of ontological feel because there's a kind of Deleuzian rehearsal about his rolling his roll uphill and redoing his world over and over again. But we can talk about that. So, the refusal to hope for external meaning, the acceptance of hopelessness, is at the heart of Sisyphus. Okay, hopefully you've now met Sisyphus, who's my guide here. You understand where he's coming from and why hopelessness is so important, I think. Hopelessness actually can lead to something quite interesting and positive. So, back to marine energy. If those involved in marine energy are refusing to give up and are accepting that they are both at the leading edge of an industry but at the periphery of the UK, what is it that they might do? Like Sisyphus, we must walk back down the hill to where our rock has fallen along with the fall of the old experimental wind turbine. We walk down to a road, and there a car is parked. An electric car. There are now 40 or more electric cars in Orkney, with charging points provided by the Island Council and an electric car dealer. It is spoken of as a place with electric car culture. This relatively recent development has been promoted by the local renewable energy industry. I said there was 200 people employed directly in marine energy, but with over 700 wind turbines and all the associated infrastructure and maintenance, there's in addition a collective called the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum, OREF, which represents and supports this much larger renewable energy industry company and community. And it's OREF that's been coordinating this move to electric cars. There's lots of interesting reasons why electric cars work really well in Orkney, but we can talk about that. But as I said, there's many of them, and one of the reasons they've been doing and promoting electric cars is simply as a way to increase the use of renewably generated electricity on the islands. Simply, if you've got too many Orkney green electrons to be sent south via the undersea cable, which is overheating, and there's no likely immediate policy shift on the national grid, then you've got to use them locally. SSE, to be fair, has done what it can. Orkney actually has one of the UK's first regional power zones, which is often called a smart grid, and that's been installed since 2006, and that actually manages the system locally within Orkney, the local grid. And they've also recently installed a prototype grid battery in Orkney. However, electric car culture is a self-determined way people can use the electricity they are generating from their own wind turbines. Orkney people using Orkney electrons. As I was told, you can see who you are in this with. In addition, there are discussions about whether the new NHS Trust Hospital, which is being built, will also be renewably powered from the Orkney renewable energy. And all this may reduce the load on the overheating cable and therefore allow the marine energy industry for Orkney and for all of us to develop. This is not hope. This is not hopelessness. This is what Albert Camus argues comes from acceptance of hopelessness. This, I would say, is defiance. Defiance is modest, it's personal, it's quiet, it's not heroic bravado, it's not about trying to save the universe. Defiance lives without hope. It lives in full acceptance of the unresolvability of the possible and the probable, and takes ownership of the task. I've taken this hopeless story of the second grid cable and looked it straight in the eye. There is no higher power to invoke, and no inherent moral value that might mean automatic success. And my story also tries to hold on to all the relations and the resistances, the obdurate authorities. As I tell my story of the electric cars, I realise that Orkney has already taken ownership of this hopeless task, as it has taken ownership of the marine energy industry and its futures. And Orkney and the people working there have refused to despair and instead act in quiet defiance. All right, we're going to wait for the epilogue one moment. Cool. Epilogue. I returned to stand at the entrance to EMEC. Neil Kermo, the director of EMEC, told me, everybody looks to us. By everybody, he is explicit. Orkney, the Highlands Islands region, Scotland, the UK, and the world. International film crews and journalists appear weekly at the test site, if not daily. Part of EMEC's business expertise is in supporting the development of test sites in Chile, Portugal, Oregon, places around the world. As Neil said, we have a responsibility to create an industry. This is a remote island archipelago of 20,000 people declaring its responsibility to make a world energy industry. Let us be clear, it is absurd. It's defiance in the face of the absurd. There is no current resolution to either the second grid cable or of any of the community benefit that might come from the commercial leases. Even the marine energy itself is in the making, and it may not hold. For when does a technology industry stop being made? What might that end look like? This model of unending, hopeless striving uphill is in complete opposition to the usual management metaphors of climbing the technology summit to the success. It is not just hoping for the best. Here, mirroring Sisyphus, they are taking ownership of the reality of a national politics that barely acknowledges marine energy existence. They take ownership of the reality of the paucity of our knowledge about the sea, and the reality of the technical challenge of keeping complex metal machines anchored in some of the fiercest water on the planet. They do so by becoming an authority of these things, by becoming an authority of marine energy in practice. And they do so by collaborating as a community, like OREF, to transform hopelessness into self-defined, self-determined, defiant action. This is not hoping for a good outcome or passing responsibility for the future elsewhere. This is day-to-day defiance in the face of the absurdity of some remote Scottish islands making a new world energy industry, dreaming of things that never were. It is not about whether they will or they won't. It is about that they are. Thank you.